Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Big update on next year's cars for 2026. Who's going to be fast, who's going to be slow, but especially what are the characteristics of these new cars going to be? Are they going to heavily favour drivers that were pretty dominant in the previous era of regulations? And how are they going to behave around the laps? Some rumours emerging these cars are going to be absolutely insane in a straight line and out of the corners. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. Lots to dive into today, starting here. Current F1 track contracts. Imola is done. It ain't coming back. Baku, Kota, Barcelona and Zandvoort all end next year. We know that next year will be the final Dutch Grand Prix for a good time to come. They've not renewed the contract. It's not staying on the calendar. Barcelona, I'd love it to stay. I love that track, but it's pretty likely that we're not going to get two Grand Prix in Spain apart from next year when Barcelona is going to be run, but it's going to be Madrid from then on out, which has a contract until 2035. Will Baku stay? Probably. They'll extend it, I would expect. Circuit of the Americas hopefully will, because that's a great track out there in Texas. Vegas, I don't think that's going anywhere. They've put so much into that. It's technically got a contract until 27, but likely to be extended, I would imagine. Singapore, Mexico's pretty interesting. We're going to discuss Perez in a second. He's going to be back on the grid. That makes a Mexican Grand Prix more attractive, I suppose. But I don't know if I see the Mexican Grand Prix lasting forever on the calendar. I don't imagine Singapore's going to be going anywhere. Suzuka until 2029. And then after that, we have some pretty long-term contracts, right? So of the tracks that could be removed, it's really these ones you're looking at here, 2026, 7, etc., that potentially, if Bangkok want a street race, could be replaced. Now, I don't know why Miami has a contract until 2041. I don't know if that's actually going to be upheld. I have a hard time believing we're actually going to be racing there for the next couple of decades, but I don't know. What do I know? Jeddah until 2030, although we think that Qadiyah, so that's the new city that the Saudis are building just south, I think, of Riyadh. They're building that spectacular track there with the huge, imagine Austin's Turn 1, but on stilts. That's pretty much what they're trying to build. Now, that city is meant to be built in the next, I don't know, 3-4 years. So maybe that's the plan, I think, is to have Jeddah and then to go to Qadiyah, maybe have both if they couldn't pay enough money. Abu Dhabi, Brazil, China. I mean, China staying on the grid. Monza 2031. Monaco, Spa, we know, though, is alternating. So Spa has a contract to be raced in 26, 27 and 29 and 31, but not in 2028 and 2030. Budapest, Qatar, Silverstone, Madrid is what it's called, Canada, Bahrain, Australia. So, you know, some good circuits on here with some longer term deals, but definitely some talk about who could be vulnerable if we get another Grand Prix on the calendar. There's been talk about Malaysia, but they shut that down. There's been talk about Turkey wanting to get back on the calendar with Istanbul Park. There's talk about numerous Grand Prix, but it's unlikely to be replacing any of these. Could they stretch to 25 Grand Prix a year? Probably they will try at some point. So that could just, you might just add another one, and Imola is gone. But is anyone else going to go from this list? We know that Barcelona's probably on its way out as well, replaced though by Madrid. So that's the current state of affairs. Now, could we get a Hockenheimring or a Nürburgring return? There was talk about that a little while ago. It does feel a bit strange that, especially with Audi coming into the grid, we don't have a German Grand Prix and German drivers on the grid as well in Nico Hülkenberg now. Vettel wasn't world champion all that long ago. So there is talk about a German Grand Prix return. Do they have the money to do it? I'm not so convinced nowadays. The other big update of the day is pretty much everyone is now telling us that it will be a Perez-Bottas partnership at Cadillac next year. Perez put this out. I don't know what he's on about, really. I don't know summers were that long. And here he is with I don't know, sitting at his desk with a printer, signing the contract, I don't know, for this new team. But the racer saying it, Giuliano De Chessa at Formula Uno, that also racer it is now, they did an article saying that, yeah, like Cadillac are preparing in this way and they're going to have a very experienced driver lineup with, we think, Bottas and Perez for next year. The race did a video looking at the driver lineup so far. Mercedes yet to be confirmed, but we know that it's going to be Russell and Antonelli. That's a matter of time. What Red Bull are going to do, we saw rumours yesterday that Hadjar getting promoted, Sonoda out, Lawson and Lindblad at Racing Bulls could make some sense. But out of all the other teams, it's only really Alpine that they have a seat. And it was interesting what they mentioned in the race video, that like Bottas and Perez have, if they do sign these contracts, is basically they're saying, yeah, they've either signed the deals or it's basically signs. The terms have been agreed. Apparently Perez was wanting to make sure that his contract was stable. We know what happened at Red Bull when he thought, because you remember how adamant Perez was during that whole period in the end of 2024 that he wasn't going anywhere. He was like, well, I've got a contract. I am a Red Bull driver. I ain't going anywhere. I don't know what you guys are talking about. But it seemed to surprise him more than it surprised us that he was eventually sacked. And it seems that Perez doesn't want that to happen again, so he wants to make sure that his terms mean that he has some stability for the longer term, and presumably they might give similar terms to Bottas as well. But Cadillac is not expected to be competitive next year. They're going to use, just like Haas, a Dallara chassis and a Ferrari power unit. They're not expected to be at the races. Bottas and Perez can provide lots of experience in winning teams, which is going to be useful for Cadillac, race winning experience of course as well, but there's a chance that they don't score a point next year. Maybe it's not especially likely, maybe they'll sneak it at some point, but it's plausible that both of them have a terrible season with a terrible car. It's actually quite likely, right? But they've chosen that because they believe in the project and the ambition over potentially going to Alpine. We think that both Bottas and Perez had discussions there with Alpine, but they effectively chose the Cadillac project over what Flavio Briatore is cooking. It will be if it happens, and the race literally put this graphic out. It doesn't even have an asterisk to say that it's not yet been confirmed. It just implies that this is what's going to happen. But for the new teams that have come into Formula One, Bar was kind of a notable one with Jacques Villeneuve and Ricardo Zonta back in 1999. I don't think they scored a point. Toyota 2002, Super Aguri. Lotus was kind of the last time that we got a team that came in with actual quality race-winning drivers, Kovalainen and Jarno Trulli, and then HRT with Shandok and Senna, Haas, obviously Grosjean and Gutierrez, and then the most recent entry will be Cadillac with, we think, a very impressive lineup given the history of lineups that new Formula One teams have had. But as I say, basically everyone's saying this now. De Kessler does an article to kind of describe that, yeah, Cadillac are going to have this Dallara chassis, the Ferrari power unit, just like Haas. Bottas has experience with the Ferrari power unit and has experience with Mercedes, could come in handy, of course, as well in their simulator and stuff like this. An Auto Racer go on to confirm in the article, according to them, the chosen pairing, barring any surprises or problems, will be Perez and Bottas, confirming recent rumours. So, yeah, basically everyone's saying this now, that will be the lineup for next year. Now, the other piece of the puzzle here that I mentioned over the last couple of days was Bottas's penalty. So Bottas got a penalty for this incident with Kevin Magnussen back in Abu Dhabi 2024, which looked at the time like it might be his last ever Grand Prix in Formula One, but it does now look like he is going to be back on the grid. Is it an especially inspired decision or maybe inspirational decision by Cadillac to sign two very experienced drivers? It's not the most exciting, but it might well be very sensible. But Bottas had a 5-place grid penalty for his next race for this incident, but of course he never raced. So when's he going to take it? His first race back with Cadillac. Now, it's been a bit of a mess this, because 2 days ago I said that, he's got this 5-place penalty, he's going to have to serve it in his first race back. Then yesterday, the story had changed, that actually he didn't have to serve it because the FIA have changed the rules. The rule now says that any penalty basically disappears after 12 months, right? It's only valid for 12 months. After that period, it's gone. But it actually turns out, as of today, that he will be serving the penalty because that penalty was applied under the old rules and there is no way in the current regulations to remove a penalty in those previous regulations, right? So Bottas and Button's penalties still apply. So it's kind of good news for F1 trivia fans that Button's penalty, if he was ever to return, still stands because the FIA has updated the sporting regs and grid penalties penalties will now expire after 12 months, but this does not apply retroactively. So Bottas's penalty and Button's will still be coming into fruition, right? Currently, the penalty will stand, as there is no mechanism to retroactively amend the penalty that was applied under the regulations that were in force at the time. The change in regulations is intended to avoid similar anomalous situations in future. So pretty funny, right? They're like, we don't want this to happen again with the likes of a Button where it's hanging over him technically. So we're just going to make them expire after 12 months. But it does mean that if Bottas comes back, which we're pretty sure that he is going to have to serve that 5 place penalty, likely in Australia, Melbourne, at the start of next season. And let's talk about those cars. 2026 is one of the big conversation points of this summer break, among some others. And how good are the cars going to be? Who's going to be the quickest? We know that Cadillac aren't expected to be very strong. A few individuals have made that pretty clear. Are the cars going to be any good? Now, the FIA are talking about how fast they're going to be. It is always a talking point from the fans. You don't want to feel like the cars are slow, like 2015 level slow, where they've just not got much downforce. They're not really any faster than Formula 2. You don't want that kind of an environment. The drivers are a bit concerned about it being an energy management championship because the electrical motor is so big that the battery deployment and management is going to be a very important story. The FIA are going to have to manage how they deal with that in the regulations. But Tombazis says that he's a bit surprised that the teams, and maybe the fans, but certainly the teams, are putting a lot of emphasis on the lap times, because he says, all right, yeah, the car might be a second and a half slower, and you're going to feel that if you hop in one simulation to the other, but it's not a massive deal when you look at it holistically and once you get used to it. He says as well, it's not going to be a huge delta. He's expecting the new cars will be between 1 and 2.5 seconds slower at the start of the regulations. That's according to their simulations, which is pretty interesting, isn't it? Because what are they simulating? What does the car look like in their simulation? I do really wonder this, because the FIA don't have 1,500 staff working on designing a car. They don't have Adrian Newey either working for them. So they've obviously designed a car in their simulations that runs in a certain way. Now, the other teams will be designing their version of that base model car that presumably some will get it wrong and be terrible, and some might get it right and be even faster. It's also worthy of note that because of the active aerodynamics, the fact that the front and the rear wings are going to move to compensate, effectively it's because the electrical motor is so big in terms of the horsepower output, and there's only so many batteries you can store, that in order to make sure the car doesn't run out of energy on the straights, they're going to have to lower the downforce on the straights to make sure that they can actually survive. It's pretty embarrassing, I think, that this is why active aero is coming back, just to compensate for what is probably a terrible set of engine regulations. But time will tell on that one. The manufacturers wanted to do it for a reason. But the FIA say the car isn't going to be that much slower. 1 to 2.5 seconds slower, and he reckons that over time teams will get it right and they'll be faster, but some other teams are probably going to get it wrong and they will be substantially slower. So we'll see how that goes. He goes on to talk a little more about the manual override mode, which is it's not DRS, but it's kind of similar to push to pass, really, where there's a certain amount of electrical energy that you can deploy, but at certain times you'll be able to override that and deploy more to try and get an overtake done if you have managed your battery well. But the other big update on 2026 is about how these cars are going to handle. We know that some drivers just prefer some types of cars over others, and that's only natural. Even if you're the best driver on the planet, right now Max Verstappen, you would say, is exactly that man, but if you put him in an understeery car around Baku, Perez can beat him, right? And we've seen that before. So it's just natural that drivers, as good as they may be and as adaptable as they may be, they're always going to have their preferences on the type of car they want to drive. And if they drive that over another one, they're going to be able to extract just a little bit more performance. Now, Hamilton obviously was a killer in multiple different regulation cycles, and you would assume that a younger driver will probably be more adaptable. Hamilton at 40, adapting to the characteristics of the Ferrari, but also to these ground effect cars, which are very stiff. You can't really throw them around as much. You can't live as much on the limit. The drivers often say that it's quicker to drive at 95, 96% than it is to drive at 100, and that's not really what Hamilton's used to with the older, let's say 2020 cars, where you could just throw it into a corner, and obviously the Mercedes back then would stick, but that was the way to drive them, right on the limit. Hamilton's early days where the cars are very nimble and agile, throwing them into corners, catching a slide, that was how the cars were fast. It's partly, I think, tyres have changed over time. If you do slide a bit, if your tyres nowadays start to slide, you get rear overheating, that loses you a lot of grip. There are a few factors in play why Hamilton just isn't as happy with these cars. And it's not just Hamilton, but of course, it's noticeable with Hamilton because he won all that until 2021. And since then, he's been strong, but, not as strong as he has been, of course, before. Is that just natural because he's 40 plus now, or is there more to it than that? That's the big question for next year. Because if Hamilton wants to win the 8th title, if Ferrari want to get back to the top, they're going to need a few things to go their way. Their engine's got to be fast and reliable. They've got to put a great aero package together. Their drivers have to mesh well with that aero package and probably get a bit of luck, but also consistently execute very strongly. As I say, reliability's got to be good, but also it's got to be a style that suits their drivers well. If you give Max a good car in a style that he likes, he will be rapid. If you give Russell at Mercedes a car that he likes and suits his style that also has the other factors, he's going to be a serious force, as are the McLarens, you would imagine, as well. So this is why, for Ferrari, but also for the other teams, you've got to put all of those pieces together to become a championship contender, and that's why it's just so difficult to win a championship. Now, James Allison, top dog at Mercedes, says this: the cars have a flat underbody and a step in the middle. So the older regulations, completely flat floor. The current regulations, heavy Venturi tunnels on the floor to generate serious vortices and downforce and suck the car into the ground using the ground effect. Now, next year's cars, the Venturi tunnels are gone. So they are removed entirely. But there will still be some level of ground effect because they've, as he describes, they've got this step in the middle. So there's some ground effect, but it's definitely far weaker, right? It's much more what it was pre-2022. He says the Venturi effect will be weaker. Nevertheless, the 2026 cars are certainly not a copy of what we saw before 2022. They sit somewhere between then and now. The handling will be more comfortable than the current cars. There will be fewer shifts in balance between slow and fast corners and between turning and accelerating. It is easier to keep understeer and oversteer exactly where you want them. So just some positives from a car designer perspective, but I think also from a certain driver perspective, right? If there's less compromise to be made, you don't have to worry about, let's say, driving the car within its limits. You just drive the car as fast as it will go, and that will suit certain drivers well. Which drivers is this good news for? Probably some of the OGs, right? I'd throw Hamilton into the mix as well. I think Alonso's done a great job with these ground effect cars in general. Certainly the start of 2023, that was true, but also you'd imagine the same might be true there, that Alonso would prefer to drive a car that is slightly more similar to what he started to drive when he came into Formula 1. The other thing that Allison mentions is that they're going to be more comfortable. Even Max Verstappen, who has dominated this era of regulations largely, let's say 2023 for example, none of the drivers enjoy driving these cars. The way that they have to be run, and not like that should matter really, should we care whether the drivers like them or not, but I think it is relevant that the car is so stiff, the suspension is so stiff, that it's a horrible ride in the car. The way that they have to manage the issue of the car being an absolute boat and understeering at the slow speed and oversteering at the high speed because it's got so much downforce from the ground effect, these are simply suboptimal ways for a regulation set to be. And yeah, the idea was that the 2022 regs would maybe have some of these issues, but they would be countered by the fact that the racing would be so much better because the dirty air disappeared. And for half of 2022, that was true. But since then, of course, that's been far less true. So, I'm not going to miss the 2022 regs, I don't think, unless the 2026 regs are even worse, which they might be. And this is the talk then about the top speed. So F1 2026 cars could reach, according to Toto Wolff, 400 kilometers an hour. In Queen's English, that is 248 miles an hour. I feel like I'm James May when he drove that Bugatti Veyron. But Toto says when full power is deployed, we will be approaching the 400 kph limit. So just to quickly break this down, as we've seen, the cars will be slower over the course of a lap by a second, 2.5 seconds, whatever. But they will probably be a lot slower than that, or significantly slower than that in the corners with the way the aero is designed. rain and everything, like it's going to be a lot less downforce than previously, but they will be really quick in a straight line. And this makes sense. The massive battery pack and the massive electrical motor, well, I mean, if you guys have an electric car, I mean, I don't, but like I've been in one, you know what it's like to accelerate these things, right? The torque delivery is just immensely consistent, that you can just absolutely fire out of a corner. And the F1 engines, these engines will have more torque than we have ever seen. So acceleration is going to be absurd. Drugovich says the car pushes like crazy out of the corners. You feel like you're sitting on a rocket. So of course, that's in the simulations. I know that James Vowell said, look, if you're in your first sim as a driver, give it 5, then you'll have your proper feedback. But you know, today we get to maybe 220 miles an hour. That's, you know, usually it's like 210, but maybe sometimes at certain conditions up to 220. They reckon maybe up to 400 kph, near enough 250 miles an hour could be possible because low downforce wings, massive torque and acceleration of corners with full power. You're approaching some absurd speeds. Maybe dangerous speeds, that's a matter for debate. The final thing just to go through, we mentioned yesterday that George Russell has only won a single Driver of the Day award in his entire career at Sakir 2020. That's kind of remarkable. These are, now I know this is just a popularity contest, but I did want to go through it real quick because Verstappen's won the most. That shouldn't be a surprise. A lot of them he deserved. A lot of them in the early days anyway, since it's been a thing in 2016, were because he was just the most exciting driver and people were voting for him. Vettel won it 23 times, Hamilton 19, Leclerc 18, Norris 18, Perez at 14. You know, we know that some of the Perez drivers are a bit cheese, right? It qualified badly, came through the grid, whatever. It happens. Ricciardo at 11, Sainz at 7, Alonso, Bottas, Piastri, Raikkonen, Albon, Grosjean, Hülkenberg, Gasly, Bortoleto, Antonelli, Tsunoda. All of those guys have 2 Driver of the Days. I mean, Bortoleto and Antonelli have only been here a year, and they've already got 2 each. Mick got 1, Zhou got 1, Stroll, Ocon, Rosberg, but of course it was introduced in 2016, and he retired at the end of 2016, Magnussen, Kvyat, Behrman, De Vries. I mean, really the standout here is Russell, right? Like, you look up and down the grid, you see many of the great multiple race winners have all won all of these Driver of the Day awards, and Russell hasn't won. It's a kind of a stark contrast, right? And maybe you can look back at the specifics and you can say, you know what, fair enough, Russell did win that race, but this other guy deserved Driver of the Day. And I can understand that, right? Like, let's say Las Vegas last year, Russell won it from pole. I'm guessing Hamilton was Driver of the Day last year. He made the, you know, the 10th to 2nd drive, which was great, right? So maybe you could say, well, Hamilton didn't deserve it, but also Russell did nothing wrong. It is what it is. Russell ain't gonna care if he wins next year's World Championships. Very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.